first car in my life was a 1923 Star. It was the car that brought me home from the hospital to 4581 Pipeline Road a few days after I was born on February the 12th, 1935. I knew immediately that life would hold many funny surprises, as the name of the doctor that delivered me was Dr. Duck. Waiting for me at home was a mom, a dad, and a sister, all ready to meet my every need. Curiously, I don't remember that car at all, except some years later, rusty and stripped of most of its parts, nearly hidden in the tall grass beside the garage. Even the upholstery and fabric top were gone, apparently eaten by the goats we had, as I was allergic to cow's milk. Next came a 1928 Chandler. This car I do remember, as it reliably took us shopping, visiting, or on family excursions to a lake for a picnic or to Brentwood for fishing. It had a goat story too. One day, my sister and I were told that we were taking the nanny for a ride to a farm to visit some other goats. We got into the back with our legs up on the seat while the goat stood on the floor in front of us. Arriving at a small farm in central Saanich, our nanny was delivered to a pen with a boy goat, while we played on the lawn and had lemonade with snacks. As I recall, we arrived home about supper time, and in a few months had a baby goat to play with. It was quite a few years before the connection was made. I have to tell one other goat anecdote. Mostly we liked the goats. They were usually friendly, didn't mind being patted, and when young kids they would play with us as baby goats do. Occasionally the goats played rough and sometimes headbutted us, enough to knock us off balance. One time the nanny got me a good one, which I did not see coming. I went down hard, landing on a tine of an upturned pitchfork. The tine embedded an inch or so in my butt. I survived. My grandfather and grandmother on my mom's side lived only a short block away from us on Pipeline Road. We saw them often, as they were usually the alternate caregivers. Many times after school, sometimes overnight, and occasionally for short trips, which were usually to town. Grandpa, like many who grew up in the horse and buggy days, never got friendly with cars, including his Model A Ford. Fact is, cars made him quite nervous, and he did not like driving, while Grandma never learned to drive at all. There were 3 routes to town in those days. Clanford was most commonly used, with Quadra a close second, while Wilkinson was a fairly rare alternative. Grandpa drove slowly and cautiously, seeming to us kids to take forever to travel short distances. He did not understand how a car worked, and appeared to expect the car to fail imminently. Evidence of this is when he came to a hill, which he would approach sedately and then rock fore and aft quite vigorously if he could help the car up the incline. Barb and I, in the back, rocked along with him and cheekily exchanged glances and laughed. Our other grandparents, Dad's mom and dad, lived on Hastings Street in Colquitts. They were always great fun to visit, and often one or more of Dad's 8 siblings and their family, our cousins, were also there, as visiting day was most often Sunday. Grandpa Walter had a Model T truck, which he used to travel from school to school, as his job made him responsible for doing minor repairs at many Saanich schools. Broken windows, wobbly desks, leaky taps, and the like were his territory, though by trade he was a cabinet maker. He had a small building for a shop at Royal Oak School, which was close to the road near the seesaws. When he was in, kids usually visited, as he liked the kids and the kids liked him. Don Harwood was older than me. He lived on the East Saanich Road beside the Jacksons. One day I was riding my bike around and saw him trying to start what I think was an old Willys Overland. Don would turn the crank and the engine would start very quietly, and then run for only about 3 seconds or 3 RPMs. We and the engine did this over and over again. certainly all afternoon, and I think the next day too. I don't know if it ever did start or run properly. Don had better luck with a Model T Ford, which was his next car. It ran very well. Don, being too young to have a driver's license, would drive the car in a field behind his house, mostly in tight circles and as fast as he dared. I rode with him once. Model Ts are not made for fast and tight quartering. He turned it on its side at least once. It was about this time that I attempted my first vehicle build. Using the remains of an old bicycle, some wood, and a bit of knowledge about soapbox racers, this pedal-powered beauty came to life. Well, almost. Various technical problems were never solved before my interest vanished, so it only traveled about 6 feet. Down at the corner of East and West Saanich Roads was the Municipal Hall, the police station, the Women's Institute Hall, Royal Oak School, the corner store, the blacksmith shop, and Massey's Garage. It was the center of town, so to speak. I hung around the blacksmith shop and Massey's Garage, hoping for some excitement. Business did not seem to me to be too good for both, though I did see some horses being shoed and some cars being worked on. The gas pump was the type where the gas had to be hand pumped up to the glass reservoir on top. I got to do this occasionally, and like Tom Sawyer's victims, thought it was a good deal for me. I only remember 2 people working in the garage, an old man who was usually sitting in the office or by the pot-bellied stove, and a cheerful, friendly young man who I guess was a mechanic, though he seemed to be there only irregularly. He went by one name. Asking around recently, Morgan officer said it was Fousey. One day I was there when he towed in an old Dodge truck. He looked at it for a while and diagnosed the problem as a broken piston. He quickly took the head off, confirmed the problem, and offered me the job of taking the pan off. I thought I had struck gold. Such responsibility. I climbed down into the pit and undid all the bolts holding the pan on. Tried to remove it, but it was stuck on, so I asked Fousey to come and help. With a hammer in his hand, he jumped into the pit, and with a bit of persuasion, the pan dropped off. He then stood with me in the pit and showed me the parts that were now visible, and pointed out what had to be done next. At the time, I did not notice that while he sensibly stood clear of the bottom of the engine, I was practically climbing inside it. Oil dripped down like a steady rain shower, soaking my hair, face, hands, shirt, pants, and everything. I was in heaven riding home with these marks of accomplishment. I guess that was around 1945 or 46 when I started my oily auto mechanics career. I remember a couple of other things about Fousey. A few times he let me ride along when he went to town to get parts. These trips usually included having coffee at Johnny's, where Fousey seemed to be really well acquainted with the waitresses. Apparently his real name was George Cliff. He also bought a war surplus Bren gun carrier. Behind and beside Massey's Garage was quite a large field, part of the raised VNS railway bed, and a large ditch that I believe used to contain some of the pipes carrying water from Beaver Lake. He took me and other kids for rides across the field, through the ditch and over the railway. Exciting stuff. I heard he ventured to other places like Beaver and Elk Lake, but never saw that. Who knows, perhaps it was licensed and it was okay to do that. I don't know. I often spent time around the Royal Oak Junction, which then was the meeting of Quadra Street, West Saanich Road, East Saanich Road, and Viewmont Road, plus the entrance to the lower level of the Municipal Hall, where the police station was located. It was a good place to car spot and people watch. Later, it was where I picked up the papers for my Tom's Colonist paper route. It was also where the bus stopped when going to town or to Mount Newton School. In those days, many of the passing cars could be identified by make and model and year, and often by the owner. It was always an informal contest to see who would be first to identify the car correctly, and perhaps add other information. Burden, Chevy. Sotheby, Dodge. Ooh, Malish, dog car. This was where the Oldfield teardrop car was usually seen. Built by H.B. Oldfield and John Norton, it always got a lot of attention. On June 3rd, 1947, I was sitting at my desk in grade 6 at Royal Oak School. It was one of those spring days with the sun shining and the end of school near, when a lot of time was spent staring out the windows rather than paying attention to the teacher. It should have been, but wasn't a surprise, when I saw my mom drive the Chandler by in a direction that would take her home. She should have been working, so this was very unusual. My dad lied about his age to join the Army when he was 16, so he could fight in the First World War. In those days, much thought was given to a regular wage and patriotic duty, while the real possibility of injury and death, at least when joining up, was dealt with by denial. Apparently this worked quite well until a man was in the trench and waiting for the whistle ordering him over the top. Dad was over the top, manning a machine gun, after the other two of the 3 men were shot. He was also shot, and as a result was sent to England to recover, though the injury led him to losing a lung. When sufficiently recovered, according to the Army doctors, he was sent back to fight. His condition did spare him the front line again, except when delivering supplies brought him close enough to get gassed, which is what happened. In 1932, he was back in Victoria, married to Jessie Thorpe, and awaiting the birth of their first child, my sister Barbara. A house had been built, and despite the recession, the outlook was promising. Not long after I was born, Dad contracted tuberculosis. One of my earliest memories of him is when we visited him in the Royal Jubilee Hospital Pavilion. He recovered, but clearly his health was further compromised. Mum was working for French's Pharmaceuticals in Victoria. Dad was working as an orderly at the Provincial Mental Hospital in Colquitt. Early in the 40s, Dad started working for the Salvation Army with a variety of interesting duties. This work included projectionists showing movies to the troops at various locations in and around Victoria, and manning a canteen vehicle at various military locations like Heels Range, Otter Point, and Albert Head. Mum also played in a band that was part of the entertainment at the regular concert parties at the Salvation Army headquarters on Broad Street. I wore a small boy-sized Army uniform that got a lot of attention when Barb and or I went to these shows or joined him on trips to the camps. On one of these trips to Souk in a near-new smooth-riding, floating Chevrolet, both of us got quite carsick. Dad, ever resourceful, stopped, knocked on the door of a resident home, and left us with some welcoming strangers. I remember it as a good time, and he did pick us up on the way back. By 1945, Dad was having signs of serious heart problems. That included a heart attack. Life went on, and though Barb and I were aware that the situation was serious, we did not know that the threat had a very short timeline. So back in the school, on June 3rd, 1947, I chose denial. For if Dad had died, then surely Mom would have stopped to pick me up. In reality, as Barb was in school at Mount Newton, Mom chose to drive there first, knowing we would then both arrive home about the same time. Life changed a lot from then on. In her wisdom, Mom recognized that some father figures in my life could be a huge benefit to me, so she enlisted the help of Dad's brothers. My Uncle Phil, who owned the Speedway service station at Douglas and Queens, and my Uncle Maury, who worked there, became my bosses and friends as well as my relatives. Initially, only working Saturdays for 25 cents an hour, I thought $2 a day in cash less bus fare to and from work was a good deal. My informal automotive apprenticeship had begun. The next year, I worked full-time in the summers as well as the Saturdays when in school. Later, when I bought a car, I worked some hours after school as well. It was quickly confirmed that I was fairly car crazy and wanted to learn how all the parts worked and how to fix them when they did not work. Working at this particular service station had a big advantage, getting exposed to a large variety of vehicles. As Douglas Street was the main road in and out of town, every type of car went by and many came in. From the McGuire brothers' identical 32 Fords, Mr. Newbigging's immaculate 1932 Chev Cabriolet Coupe, Nan Lal's Ford wood truck, and the newest Cadillacs from California. I saw them all. The best story was when a woman who was a regular customer came in complaining of a squeaking in her Plymouth. I searched through the car, and it turned out to be a baby mouse. Honest, I have the news clippings. Because of working at this particular service station, there were two more groups of cars that I got a chance to become familiar with: antique cars and race cars. Phil collected antique cars like this 1911 auto carrier. This was made in England and, as you see, had only 3 wheels and conveniently in the rear a mother-in-law's seat. Many of Phil's antiques were regularly entered at the 24th of May parade, and this 1906 Model N Ford is the one that my dad usually drove. In this photo, I am the passenger. Elizabeth, a 1912 Model T that is now in the Royal BC Museum, was a favorite. As parts were still available and it was relatively easy to repair, it was kept at the station more than the others, who mostly resided in Phil's basement. It was often used to drive the 5 blocks for coffee breaks or perhaps further for picking up parts. It was always in the Victoria Parade, and I once drove it to Sydney for a parade. The 1914 LaFrance fire engine was a big favorite of mine. The huge engine had considerable power and was remarkably easy to start, providing you were strong enough to turn the crank. Shifting gears required some skill as it had no synchro mesh, and the inexperienced would surely grind the straight cut gears. In this photo, I am driving it in the 24th of May parade with Tim Hives and Jack Hill. It had no license and neither did I, but with a large tank of water, we used war surplus stirrup water pumps to spray anyone who came close, including the motorcycle cops patrolling the crowds. Then they only smiled. Can you imagine what would happen today? Other cars in Phil's collection included a 1909 Hupmobile, a 1900 Dedean, a 1912 Detroit Electric, a 1911 Mitchell, and a 1939 V12 Lincoln. His brother-in-law owned this magnificent 7-passenger Buzz Light. The before and after photos give some idea of how much work restoring these cars could be. Here is a photo of Phil's service station as it was originally. A large 5-bay addition was added later. The next photos are in Fernwood of his brother Eric's service station and the Fernwood garage tow truck. This last photo is not identified, but my guess is that it is a mid-40s photo, while the lineup is about gas rationing. One of Phil's daily driver cars was a Franklin air-cooled, similar to this one. The Franklin was a good car, and its flexible wooden frame contributed to a smooth ride. My Uncle Maury owned a 1936 DeSoto, similar to the one in this photo. I'm featuring it because it was one of the first cars I often drove, on the street while going for parts, or perhaps to the bank or post office. A Buick like the one pictured here stayed in my mind because the owner, Ray Campbell, a Victoria fireman and a customer at the station, was very kind to me. He painted my bike metallic blue before I had a car. He painted my car flat black, which was very cool in those days, and when for some reason or other my car was apart and undrivable, he let me use his Buick to drive between home, school, and work. Fortunately, I did not hurt it. He was generous, and I am grateful. Meanwhile, at home, Grandpa Thorpe's wife had died. He sold his house, built an addition onto ours, and moved in with us. This was not a popular move with me, as he found me wanting in every way and constantly reminded me of his opinion. Quite a few years later, when he was seriously ill, I drove him to town to see his doctor. Arriving at the building, he gave me $2 for gas, asked if that was enough, and in an unprecedented event smiled. It was a one-off event. He died shortly after. About a year prior, he had sold the Model A and bought a Morris 10-4. To me, this was a rather silly and underpowered English car. It was a boon to Mum, as I don't think he ever drove it, so it really became her car. I drove it quite a bit while learning to drive, but I always felt it was not like driving a real car. As I grew up in the early 1900s, cars were an important part of my uncle's lives. Phil and Maury, who was David Foster's dad, and Eric, who was Billy Foster's dad, all made their livelihood from cars and or mechanics for much of their lives. This led them to become involved in racing very early. Racing parts were available very early too, and the Model T engine and later the Model A engines and V8 engines were popular choices to modify, as they were very available, not too expensive, and worked well. Uncle Phil built at least 3 race cars of the sprint car type. Here are photos of a Buick sprint car he built. A before photo with it all straight and shiny, and an after photo. The after being after going through the fence at the Willows track. His gas station was named Speedway Service because of the Racing Association. When the American racers came to town, many made Phil's garage a sort of home base, stopping there first before heading to the track. Having race cars around on a Saturday afternoon was very common, and some of the drivers became lifelong family friends. In this picture, Jerry Van Trite is either avoiding or about to become part of a wreck in his number 23 car. The engine was a Model T-based Fronte Ford, and he was still driving it after World War II when racing resumed. Jerry, like most race car drivers, was an interesting guy. I knew him because he worked part-time for Phil as a body man, and also was Maury's brother-in-law. He had a reputation for being fearless but not reckless on the track, while driving like Grandma on the road in his very modest Willys. One race, Jerry's car broke before the race finished. He let the car sit for a few weeks until one Saturday he showed up at the service station, race car in tow, and took the engine apart. He had had the same problem as that old truck at Massey's garage when I got oiled up. He fitted a new piston, put the engine together, and headed out to the track. Proving that racing is a tough game, he blew another piston in his first race, which I think ended his career as a car holder. I liked car racing and race cars, and the people associated with racing. Maury and Bert Reed sometimes took me to the races at Langford, which I very much appreciated. My interest in racing continued when the stock car racing became very popular after the Langerhurst track closed and another opened at Cobble Hill. Meanwhile, my life moved on. I was going to school at Mount Newton and had to take the Coach Line's bus from Willow Junction to the corner of Keating Crossroad and the East Saanich Road. We then had to walk to the school, and then back again in the afternoon. I think Dick Varley was the first to have his own car and drive it to school. I believe it was a Hudson Airplane. I could phone him and ask, but it doesn't matter, as the important thing is that he would often pick us up as we toiled up the Keating Hill and gave us a ride to school. A side note would be that at Royal Oak School during lunchtime a soccer game always started with the forwards playing the Chevs and the teams being formed by individual choice. Dick was a Ford guy, a good player, and usually on the winning team. Thanks for the rides, Dick. On the way home, I would try to hitch a ride home rather than wait for the bus. Occasionally I got a ride. One person who picked me up quite often was Don Ross. He was a trucker, usually hauling sand or gravel in his British Leyland diesel truck. This was probably the only truck of this type on the island, and it got a lot of attention, as most were driving Ford or Chevy products. I thought it was a great truck as it gave me a ride home, and rare was the trucker that would stop to pick up a hitchhiker at the bottom of the long hill on East Saanich Road. Without a good run, the engine had to work really hard from a dead stop to the crest of that hill. Another Good Guy award has to go to Gail Dresser's dad. I was taking Gail out on a date, and for some reason, he offered to let us use his Chevy. Talk about a recipe for disaster. Turned out okay, as I got her home on time, and without damage, to her or the car. Certainly one of the biggest deals in a teenager's life is buying the first car. Like losing your virginity, it only happens once. Why did I pick this 36 Ford? Infatuation, I think. I repaired most parts of this car at least once, and some many times. Even parts that did not need fixing, I took apart to see what was inside and how it worked. When I first got it, it burned so much oil I carried a couple of gallons of used oil with me. It used almost as much oil as it did gas, but I did not mind at all. It was my car. Even usually shy or cautious girls rarely hesitated when offered a ride. Bold ones might ask for a ride, and mostly they were all welcome to join me in my drive to freedom. I don't know if owning a car while in high school affected my chances of having that special high school sweetheart. In 1953, I graduated as one of the small class of 13 from the first grade 12 class at the New Royal Oak School. Around the same time, I started working on Dick Farley's 1934 Ford V8 stock car pit crew. Also on the crew was Fred Cockett and Bob Vantrite, Jerry's younger brother, and Bill Lees. Lamont Brooks also built a car, and in some ways it was almost a two-car team. Lamont continued racing for some time, including road racing, where a racing accident later took his life. I worked on the cars 1 or 2 nights a week. Dick probably almost all nights a week, and then went racing on Saturday and some holidays during the race season. Initially, the racing was a track in Cobble Hill prior to the opening of Western Speedway. Dick was a good driver and won many races and a championship. For us in the pit crew, during the race, it was usually an either-or situation. When things went well, there was not a lot to do, mainly looking for things that might cause a problem or making small changes to hopefully make the car faster. When things did not go well, it was racing the clock, often without the right tools or parts, in the mud and in semi-darkness, to fix what got broken or bent during the race. Dick prepared very well and was a good team leader, so I know we had it better than many of the crews. Partying was almost a requirement of belonging to the race fraternity, and I joined in wholeheartedly. After the race, many drivers and crews, along with wives and girlfriends, went to the 6 Mile House, where you could drink till it closed for less than $2. Very often there was a house party after that, usually lasting till near dawn, and on some special occasions like Labor Day weekend, perhaps till Monday. The next stop after the party was often Mac's Cafe on the Gorge Road. Dick wisely abstained from these parties. About this time I bought my cousin, Billy Foster, 1940 Chevy Coupe. It was a big step up from the old 36 Ford and stood out in the crowd for 2 main reasons. It looked really good with its customizing and was the loudest car in town when driven aggressively. It was now 1956. I was 21. Mom had sold the house at Royal Oak and we had moved to town. But I went to work at National Motors, a Ford dealership, as a service salesman. This was a good job that I enjoyed and learned from. For the most part, the staff were friendly and cooperative, and several were in vitro or connected to racing, in some way like driver owners Dick Rodell and Bob Mull. The pay was better, particularly when they brought in a commission system, so my dress improved, haircuts came more often, and dinner dates were at better places. Mainly the job was to make the customers happy without pissing off the mechanics and other employees. This was not always easy, as there was an underlying conflict. The customer wanted it done cheap or preferably free, while the staff and management wanted maximum profit in a minimum of time. Fortunately, the company owner, Logan Mayhew, was a reasonable and well-liked man, and I believe that influenced outcomes. The customer base was of course varied, and I met some interesting ones. The brilliant and feisty lawyer and later judge, George Gregory, could not, I think, ever be wholly satisfied with our maintenance of his '55 Thunderbird. But it never came to fisticuffs, nor did he go over my head, so I guess a relationship was achieved. Mercury owner and later much acclaimed artist Elsa Mayhew was Mr. Mayhew's sister and just beginning to be recognized. She could have swung heavy weight, but was wonderful to deal with and invited me to her home to talk art. I might have had a small crush on her. Also a Mercury driver, a local restaurant owner, was a feared customer because of her often unreasonable demands. But I sort of won her over with a little homegrown psychology. Most had given up even pretending to listen to her long ago, so even the pretense pleased her. She was not attractive, so I dated her daughter. A local doctor, a close friend of Mr. Mayhew, ordered an Allard station wagon from England. It was custom built with a Lincoln engine. Because of the Lincoln engine, we dealt with a warranty. The car was a horror. The partly wooden body rattled and shook on the slightest bump. The steering felt very much like a huge shopping cart with wobbly wheels, and on acceleration or deceleration, doubts grew as to if the engine was actually bolted in the car. Curiously, and fortunately, to my knowledge, the owner complained little. Perhaps he realized he shared much of the blame, as he has chosen to buy such a ridiculous car. Another customer I met was Barbara Parsons. Her and her husband, Doug, had a home on Salt Spring Island and a 1954 Ford. We chatted, and she invited me to visit, which I did. They were buying a large property, some of it waterfront, and took a large part of their earnings to pay for. But it was a good plan for the future. We became friends, and I visited irregularly, particularly during hunting season. Later, when I was out of work for a while, I stayed in a cabin they had. I worked off my rent by redoing the cabin, painting their very large classic barn, and various other jobs, including cutting and splitting cedar fence posts. I enjoyed learning this skill, but have not used it since. We were in partnership for a while with about 40 cows. They supplying the land, I supplying the animals. Bad idea. Animals too often die. We remained friends until he tragically died shortly after retiring, so I only briefly enjoyed what he had worked so long and hard for. Another interesting customer was a lady from a small town whose '55 Ford was a town taxi. I visited them too, and later dated her daughter. One of the fellows I worked with at National Motors told me good money was to be made by renting your car to visitors. Shortly after, he had an extra customer and offered the rental to me. A few days later, I picked up a family, mom, dad, son, and daughter, who were from the prairies. We agreed on a price, and as a bonus, I took out the really cute red-headed daughter. More importantly, National Motors was where I met the girl I would eventually marry. At the time, Sandy was 16 years old and I was 23. I was impressed and made a note to myself to check back in a few years. Back to stock car racing, the sanctioning club was Vitra, Vancouver Island Truck Racing Association, who drew up and enforced the rules. In 1959, I was president of the club as no one else wanted the job. One of the benefits of being president of Vitra was picking a young lady usually from the incoming crowd, to be the trophy girl. After the cars timed in, the first race was the trophy dash, run by the 4 fastest cars. I would use a new car borrowed from National Motors to pick up the girl, do one circuit on the track to the start-finish line, where she would present the trophy to the winner. The car was usually an Edsel or a Thunderbird. There was nothing wrong with the Edsels, but clearly they were not accepted by the public. I only dated one of the trophy girls. I met Dick Willoughby while working at National Motors. He was a car painter, stock car owner-driver, and a popular and unique person. We became good friends very quickly. We took up skin diving at the same time and partnered in buying a boat for diving, a converted lifeboat called the Brewmaster. Interestingly, it had a Star engine, just like the one in my parents' first car. We took the boat to Port Angeles for a diving beat, hit a log in the harbor, and drove it on the beach to prevent it from sinking. When the tide went out, we nailed a patch on, pumped it out, and were good to go for the trip home. We used the boat quite often. When we kept it in Victoria, a Saturday afternoon cruise up the Gorge Hotel made a nice trip, though mostly we kept it at Sydney for skin diving trips. Before starting the Quarter Miler story, there are 3 short stories that need to be in this timeline. First is building this goofy clown car. Again, Dick Varley comes into the story as he gave me this old English 1/4 ton Thames and the engine and running gear from a North American Ford V8. I patched them together to make what you see in the photos. I used it for laughs in parades and at the Speedway, and also scared a lot of people with it, as on board I had an oxyacetylene cannon that when fired made a noise equal to 2 or 3 shotguns fired simultaneously. It could also shoot missiles a considerable distance, which I did not do, and damage ears, which it did do. The second story started about 1950, when for a reason I don't remember, Lee Chu gave me and some others a ride in his brand new 1950 Meteor Coupe. It was a sweet car, but only a blip on the radar at the time. The story got more interesting when Lee traded it in at National Motors when I was working there. Lee had kept it in good shape. Other than the color, which was two-tone yellow and blue, the car was good with a near-new motor and the body free of dents and dings. I bought that car immediately. Dick Willoughby painted it for me in a dark plum metallic. A few other bits of customizer were done that made it an all-round cool car, and I kept it for many years. Story number 3 was when there appeared in town the most amazing 1934 Ford, very customized hot rod. Not only was it chopped and channeled, but it also had a full custom front end, a 1950 Oldsmobile Rocket 88 engine, and a host of other bells and whistles that made it a standout car. I was determined to own it, so I chased it one day to meet the owner. He was interested in selling, so the deal was made. The main downside was the time and money needed to maintain it, fix it, and make changes or additions to keep it in contention for car shows. The major jobs were repainting it twice, first metallic blue and later the mandarin orange, and making a hood with a scoop, which Grant King did. It was fun to drive, though not always practical. It had no heater or defroster, so if it was cold, the engine heat that came into the driver's compartment was not enough in winter and too much in summer. And in rain, small glass area and puny windshield wiper made visibility a problem. It only let me down twice. Once late at night in town, the clutch linkage snapped, but I got it home okay with a vice grip improvisation. The other time was when the drive shaft broke in Portland. Being able to coast into a service station whose owner was hot rod friendly meant I had a place to work, and it only cost me the price of some welding. The big upside of owning a car like this was meeting all the like-minded people. I showed the car in Victoria at our own quarter milers, 1958, 59, and 60 shows. In Vancouver at the BCCCA show on the PNE grounds for the same years, and at Bremerton, Washington, and Nanaimo. The car won a bag of trophies, and I won for several booth displays. It amazed me what people would lend if asked politely. For the orange crate display, the oranges were borrowed from the wholesaler without so much as a question or deposit. Just my word that I would return them. When I returned the cast bronze Buddha borrowed for the Madrid display, I asked the owner if it was valuable. He said it was worth about $5,000, and he had lent it on a handshake. After being laid off from National Motors, I worked at Olson Motors as both service salesman and control operator. It was an okay place to work, and the owner, Mr. Lumsden, was grizzled and feisty, the total opposite of Mr. Mayhew. Nevertheless, he was mostly easy to get along with, and he did little more than frown when he heard me singing Christmas carols over the PA system. I realize now that automotive dealers made changes often, so when I was laid off from Olson Motors, I did the Salt Spring Island thing I talked about earlier. When on Salt Spring, I got a call from Inside Motors. They wanted me to start working for them at once, and as the offer was okay, I went back to the automotive business. Back again working with cars. My boss was Lauren Heath, and he was a super guy. The other employees were good too, and I already knew some of them from playing automotive musical chairs. The owner was George Hankinson, who was in a class all by himself. He asked a lot, but rewarded good performance. As long as a person was honest, you would get his support. He believed in moving staff around to give them more experience, so I was alternately service salesman, control operator, service station manager, and when he bought Motorsport, a unique 4-bay service station auto shop in Oak Bay, he sent me out to manage it, along with a mechanic and a pump jockey. I stayed there until I was married and left because I was hired to manage the new Wilco Automotive. The timing was good, as Mr. Hankinson was apparently in some trouble with Chrysler Corporation, and not too long after he left. Meanwhile, a letter I wrote to the paper about the need for a safe place to race was published and supported by a lot of like-minded people. We wanted a drag strip, and to accomplish that, we needed some organization. A fellow named Bob Clark, among others, was at the same time as I, looking toward the same objective. So shortly after, we held a meeting with everyone we knew that was interested and formed the Quarter Milers Club. The club grew fast with strong, enthusiastic members from all over Greater Victoria. It quickly voted in its first group of officers and worked out a plan of attack to get a drag strip. I'm not going to attempt to tell the whole Quarter Miler story. The basic plan was gain attention in good ways, similar to the work service clubs do, design and show our colors, have car shows, and work on the ways and means of actually achieving the main goal of getting a drag strip. Progress made was surprisingly quick. Another founding member, Rod Stevens, and myself, took on responsibility in the early days for publicity via the media, which in those days was mostly newspaper, though early on we were on the fledgling Czech TV. There is more information and photos on the Quarter Milers' history at the end of this video. It was now 1962. I was 27 and living on Salt Spring Island. Country life had given me lots of time to think, and one of the main things I thought about was that girl I met 4 years earlier at National Motors. I called Sandy and we started to date, which is the best idea I had had in a long time. Long-distance dating was awkward, so the Ensign Chrysler job came along at the best possible time. We were soon engaged and married on April 20th, 1963. Predictably, marriage brought changes. The 34 Ford Hot Rod was sold, a house was bought, our first daughter was born in March 1964, and I started work as manager of the brand new Wilco Automotive Center. And there was little time for car stuff outside of work. The rest of the story about married life I will tell at another time, as there are still final bits to add to the growing up with cars story. Quite a few different and unremarkable cars came and went as years went by. A 50 Chev with baby seater was Sandy's first car, a 64 Pontiac Parisienne, and then a 65 Chevrolet Impala meant that the Meteor could replace the 50 Chev. There was also a 56 GMC panel truck, a Dodge, a Volkswagen Rabbit, Toyota Corolla, Mazda 626 named Bluebird by the grandchildren, who traveled more miles in it than I did, and today a PT Cruiser for Sandy and a Ford Ranger for me. The GMC truck is the only one worth a few extra words. We had some property on Salt Spring Island and needed a truck, as it seemed we were always hauling stuff over there. A fellow that worked for me at Wilco Automotive had this truck that was mechanically excellent, while the body and paint looked like it had just barely survived several accidents, a flood, and a fire. The black and white paint that remained made it look like an old police Maria. It was totally reliable and astonishingly useful. The testing station was open then, and despite the laughter of the inspectors, they were never able to find anything but the most minor of problems. I installed a bench seat in the back to make it a 6 to 15 passenger vehicle, depending on the size of the bodies. We traveled some back roads, one that was a creek bed in the bush between Victoria and Lake Cowichan, and slept in the back. I had plowed and planted over 2 acres of field at Salt Spring in grass and clover, and bought an old 3-gang mower from Maddox Golf Course, which the truck pulled around to keep it mowed. It was a hugely useful and curiously entertaining drive, something that looked like crap while being bulletproof in performance. Sometimes we drove it instead of the 65 Impala just for fun, and enjoyed the way other drivers stayed well clear. We had it for about 10 years, and when we sold it, we got what we paid for it. 1967, my cousin Billy Foster was killed during racing practice at Riverside, California. He grew up with racing being a part of his life, and he was good at it. His larger-than-life and irrepressible personality made him a well-liked and popular guy. As his talent developed, he got noticed. That meant he got better rides in better cars at tracks that offered better money. He raced for the big boys, like Mario Andretti, who talks about Billy in his book. Although he did not win there, he qualified well and raced in the Indianapolis 500, among other major races. A particularly tragic footnote to Billy's death is that almost exactly 2 years earlier, his brother and only sibling, Stephen, had died of cancer. In 1989, we timed a visit to a friend in California to coincide with his planned trip to Bremerton to put his vintage speedboat and his customized and supercharged 1956 Studebaker Hawk into storage at his parents' house. The boat was on a trailer which the car could tow, and we were not in a big hurry, so it sounded like fun, and he appreciated the company. Other than a wheel coming off the trailer 3 times, it was a fine trip. The first time it was a what the hell is that moment, with smoke, noise, and lurching. We were on the side of the highway, miles from help, and the wheel was in the bushes. The problem was that the trailer was hugely overloaded, and that had burned out a wheel bearing. The problem was compounded as the heat buildup prior to failure had welded the inner bearing race to the spindle. We needed new parts, and more importantly, we needed a welding torch to cut the bearing off the spindle. Lots of traffic was going by, but most of it was traveling 80 miles per hour, and it was getting dark. We unhooked the trailer, and our friend Darwin headed to the nearest town to buy parts. Sandy and I ripped the box apart to get a large piece of cardboard and wrote on it, "Need welding torch." Sandy stood holding the sign towards the oncoming traffic. I worked at cleaning up the wheel half of the bearing and hoping. In less than 10 minutes, a truck came to a quick stop, backed up to the trailer, and two very nice guys asked what the problem was. They understood immediately, and with an oxyacetylene torch, cut off the damaged bearing. There was nothing more they could do, so we thanked them profusely and offered to pay them, which they refused. Eventually, Darwin came back with new parts, which we installed in the damaged spindle and headed out again. Knowing we had not fixed the basic problem, which was overloading, we were ready for the next failure and caught it before it welded itself on like the first time, and was therefore an easy fix. The third time was as we entered the parking lot at our destination. Again, we caught it in time for an easy fix. This was not the end of our adventures with Studebakers, as in 1994, Darwin called from San Francisco, wondering if we would like to come down and visit, and, oh yeah, drive a Studebaker back down, this time not pulling a trailer. We were ready for a holiday and an adventure, so agreed. The car had not been used for about 5 years, so Darwin had it taken to a shop and checked out for the trip. It was pronounced good to go, so we headed to Bremerton to pick it up. It was a nice car and a pleasure to drive, as well as a great conversation starter, so we were enthusiastic when we saw it again, all bright and shiny. Before leaving, we checked to see if it had a spare and a jack and a wheel wrench. I tried out the jack to see if it fit the car and if it actually worked. As the car lifted, about half a gallon of gas poured out from under. Flashback to 1989. After filling the tank, we could smell gas for a while. Whatever was wrong then was still wrong now. As the first leg of our trip was a short hop to Puyallup to visit a cousin, I figured I could check it out there. We headed out and about 20 minutes later stopped at an auto supply store for emergency repair items like oil and I don't remember what else. Got in the car and it would not start. Things were not going well so far. Always trying the easiest things first, I checked for loose wires and found none, so I ran a clean cloth, probably my hanky, through the points. A small streak of dirt, oil, showed on the hanky, so I figured that was the problem, and sure enough it started just fine, and we soon arrived at my cousin's without a problem. The next morning I tackled the gas tank. Being certain the leak was on top of the gas tank where the fuel gauge was, I lifted the carpet to find the access hole. There was none. It meant either remove the fuel tank that was full of gas or cut a hole in the trunk floor. I chose the latter. So while the ladies went to find some gasket material and wheel nuts, as I found some were missing, I looked for other problems. Soon a new gasket and wheel nuts were installed, and we headed out with the car running great and no gas smell. We drove until it was time to find a place to stay, and when we did, we called it a day. The next day, after about 2 hours of driving, we stopped for coffee, and when we started again, the car ran rough and then stopped and would not start. Suspecting more dirt on the points, I got out my hanky and gave them a wipe. More dirt or oil was removed from the points, and the car then started and ran just fine. It was turning into a really hot day with more forecast for tomorrow. One more stop before finding a motel, and again the engine would not start. Brutally hot under the hood, same problem, same fix. got to a motel and sat wondering where the oil or dirt was coming from that was getting on the points. The next morning when all was cool, I opened up the distributor to have another look. On the previous repairs, I had wiped out the distributor cap and everything else I could see, and all had seemed good. This time I took off the centrifugal timing advanced mechanism, which on top was bright and shiny, but at the bottom, the part I couldn't see when it was installed, was also clean except for some very tiny blobs of very old and hard grease. Apparently what was happening was that when the parts got really hot, a bit of this thick grease would melt just enough to deposit a small drip on the points that were directly in line below. It was okay when the engine was running because then it would throw the oil aside. A thorough cleaning and we set off with a lot of confidence. Our sharp right turn to the coast road at a relaxed time talking to people about the Studi, including some that did not know what kind of car it was, made the rest of the trip what we were hoping for, all the way to Frisco. So that is my story of growing up with cars. I guess growing up with cars may be a bit of an oxymoron, particularly from some wives' point of view. On the other hand, messing around with cars can be a good way to stay young. As the first leg of our trip was a short hop to and do that again.